Closing sales is one of the cruelest things two professionals do to each other. Let's take a different look at closing the sale. We were taught that nothing happens until the sale is made. That was the old way of thinking. And now that we know there are two kinds of people in the world, those that know they're in sales and those that don't, the new approach is everyone is involved after the sale is made. This is the arsenal you're bringing to the table. It's not you, it's your organization, your product, your service, everything the customer is going to receive. Well, closing sales is cruel. Sellers resist it for fear of rejection. And buyers resist it for fear of commitment. Once they've said it yes to us, they've said no to everyone else. What if they didn't make the right decision? Now, does it amaze you that two men can never get together and do business? What are the two things that us men fear most? Rejection and commitment. So it amazes me that two men could ever do business, and yet we do. Remember this, sales is a mind-to-mind experience. And if each of those minds has some level of fear, the experience is not going to be great. So we're trying to eliminate fear. For the seller, remember this. When someone buys from you, you're not doing something to them, you're doing something for them. The preposition is critical. In timeshare, we feel the high pressure, and I think it's because the sellers know this is really not the best thing the buyer could be spending their money on. And the same is true for some unscrupulous used car dealers. Sellers telegraph the fact that they're going to be asking for the order. The statistics show that 93% or low 90 percentile of our communication with our buyers is subliminal or subconscious. Choice of words, intonation of the voice, body language. And so the buyer begins to pick up on the fact, they're moving in for the sale. And we're probably going to say, press hard, you're making 5 copies, or we're taking a better approach, which is what we're explaining here. Buyers begin resisting immediately. And so the tension goes up for the buyer and the tension goes up for the seller. And we start seeing this resistance building in the atmosphere. Either party may become emotional. The buyer may, as a defensive mood, become obstinate and ask us to leave or something like that. When the buyer is resisting, it's an indication we missed something in the sales process. But now we have an opportunity to correct it. How do we go about doing that? We make sales a non-event, not a major event. Not a press hard, you're making 5 copies, not you're obligating your organization to my organization. Make it a non-event instead of a major event. How do we do that? We could say something to the buyer like, well, once we have this paperwork out of the way, you will see your new unit up and running in 3 days. Pretty common format for a statement, but look at it closely. There is no seller personal pronoun. Even though the seller is going to win a commission or win a sale or whatever, we use plural pronouns whenever we can because us and the buyer are doing this piece of business. We are doing this piece of business. And then you'll notice you will see your new unit up and running. We try to involve the buyer as much as possible without involving ourselves. And then restate the benefits. This is a time to restate the benefits, but notice we qualify them and quantify them. If we said something like, well, from our discussions, the new unit will increase your productivity by 8% and reduce your energy costs by $200 a month, is that right? Get a confirmation back from the buyer. But you'll notice that everything in green is a qualifier and the things in blue are quantifiers. Instead of saying, hey, this is going to increase your productivity, this will increase your productivity by 8%, quantified. Your power bill is going to be less. Your power bill will be reduced by $200. Qualify and quantify. It reduces fear and builds confidence for both the buyer and the seller. Then when you're setting the meeting, you start closing. I believe we pre-close as early as possible. The whole sales adventure is about closing the sale. Hey, I'm confirming our appointment today. What additional information will you need to make a decision? Who else will need to be involved for us to put this to bed? In other words, the buyer understands the purpose of the call. I'm coming out to make a decision. You can also pre-close when you open the meeting. Thank you for the opportunity to help you with this profitable project. The most powerful word in that statement, by the way, is the word help. Helping will stop men in Armani suits on the streets of Manhattan when it's raining. I've tried it, it works. So we're helping the customer achieve their objective, solve their problem. Let's remind them of that. And then you could ask a question like, what else do we need to do before we launch this initiative? Not before you commit to buying, not before we take your money, not before I get a PO from you. What else do we need to do before we launch this initiative? Now, these ideas are in my vernacular, but you make them yours. You say it the way you would say it. Who was the greatest salesperson of all time? Could it have been Fred Herman? You may never have heard of Fred Herman, but he was one of my favorite sales trainers. As you can tell by looking at him, he was a happy person, nice person to be around. He wrote the original book, Keep It Simple, Salesperson, on the premise that sales is simple, but it's not easy. He was on the Johnny Carson show, and as a result of that, he was invited to be on a daytime talk show called The Mike Douglas Show. Mike Douglas had the same format. It was just in the afternoon. And Mike Douglas had a co-host, just like Johnny Carson did, which was Ed McMahon, but he had a co-host, but he rotated the co-host. It wasn't the same person every time. And unbeknownst to Fred, the decision had been made that they would put Fred on air and then make him out to be a sales buffoon, the typical sales guy. And one thing Fred did not like was ever being called the world's greatest salesperson. He said nobody deserves that title. Well, he came on the show, and Mike Douglas was nice to him, but the co-host was giving him grief. And so the co-host said, "So you're the world's greatest salesperson, huh?" And Fred said, "Well, nobody really deserves that." He said, "If you're such a great salesperson, why don't you sell me that ashtray right there?" And Fred said, "Well, you don't smoke. What would you do with an ashtray?" And the co-host said, "I would put it on my dresser at night and put my keys and change in it." And Fred said, "Well, what would something like that be worth to you?" He said, $1. And Fred said, "Well, I'll sell it to you for $1. Two questions. He had done a needs analysis, he had qualified, and he had quantified and closed the sale. Can you see why he would write a book called Keep It Simple, Salesperson? Fred Herman knew the GOAT, the greatest of all-time salesperson in my estimation, and he read from a biography of the GOAT in his seminars. And as of this recording, you can find some of his material at Amazon.com, looking at some of the content. An introduction by Earl Nightingale, by the way. Fred was great, but he wasn't the GOAT. So when we think about closing sales, let's start making it a non-event. And remember, through the entire process, you're not hurting the customer, you're doing something for them, helping them achieve their objective or helping them solve a problem. And always teach others.